Hello students, I hope you all are safe at your home. Today we are going to start our new chapter, chapter 5th, Footprints Without Feet. And this chapter is taken from the book, supplementary book, Footprints Without Feet. This chapter is written by H.G. Wells. So this is my lecture number 1, class 10th, subject English. Topics to be covered today. First of all, we shall read the introduction of the author H.G. Wells. Then introduction of the chapter Footprints Without Feet. Then we shall read key points of the chapter, and after key points we shall read and understand the summary of the chapter Footprints Without Feet. And at last we shall learn today some new words related to this chapter. Let us begin with the introduction of the author. About the author. The author is H.G. Wells, Herbert George Wells. H.G. Wells was a writer of science fiction works including The Time Machine and War of the Worlds, who had a great influence on our vision of the future. H.G. Wells, let us talk about first of all his birth. H.G. Wells was born in England in 1866 on September 21st, and he died on August 13th, 1946. Wells became an overnight literary sensation with the publication of the novel The Time Machine. The Time Machine was actually an instant success, and Wells produced a series of science fiction novels which pioneered our ideas of the future. The book was about an English scientist who develops a time travel machine. He published The Island of Dr. Moreau in 1896, The Invisible Man in 1897, and The War of the Worlds in 1898. The Island of Dr. Moreau told the story of a man who encounters a scientist conducting the gruesome experiments on animals, creating new species of creature. And at last he died in 1946. So this is all about the author H.G. Wells. Introduction to the lesson Footprints Without Feet. Can a man become invisible? Can you think a man become invisible? Actually, this is a story of a scientist who discovers how to make himself invisible. Does he use or misuse his discovery? This we have to find out after the reading of the chapter. This story is actually about a scientist, Griffin, who discovers a drug which makes a person invisible. So the story is about a scientist named Griffin. He discovers the rare chemicals which can make a man invisible. But at the same time, the man can be touched and felt physically. Means he uses that drug for his personal gains and his body became transparent. So now upon ejected by the landlord, he burned his house down, then became a wanderer without clothes, money and home. And later on he went to a London store, then to a theatrical company, after that to a village, and at last he was once again invisible. So let us read and find out how he uses or misuses his powers for his own Actually, this whole story revolves around one character, and that character is Griffin. Griffin was a brilliant scientist, but he was a lawless person. So, let us begin with key points of this chapter. First of all, after that, we shall read the summary of this chapter. Now, let us discuss key points of this chapter. Griffin, a scientist, discovers a rare drug which can make a person invisible. His landlord dislikes him. Griffin wants to revenge on him. He swallows the drug and puts the house on fire. He puts off his clothes and becomes invisible and runs away. It was cold weather and he felt the need of the clothes. He slips inside a clothes store to have meal and sleeps at night there. Two attendants chase him in the morning. He was again homeless and clothesless. He loots a shopkeeper of a theatrical company and catches a train to Iping village to live in a village. So first of all, he was wandering in the street of London. Then he entered a big London store, and after that he went to a theatrical company, and from there he went to Iping village. The money of loot doesn't last long. He steals money from clergyman's desk to pay rent. Suspicion falls on the scientist when he pays rent. Mrs. Hall, who was the owner of the inn of that hotel, finds the room of the scientist opened one day. She wants to look into the room. A hat springs up and hits on her face. Now Mrs. Hall was fully convinced that the room was haunted by spirits. The chair of the room becomes alive and forces Mr. and Mrs. Hall out of the room. Suddenly Griffin appears from nowhere. When Mr. and Mrs. Hall inquire about the theft, Griffin gets angry. Mrs. Hall asked Mr. Griffin how he had entered the locked room. He was quick-tempered, so he became very furious. So when the constable Mr. Jeffers arrived, he was quite surprised to see that the man whom he had to arrest was a headless man, because he removed the bandages and false nose. Now he was headless. The constable Mr. Jeffers is called actually to arrest the headless man, but he is wounded by the invisible scientist. The policeman was trying to get hold of a man who was becoming more and more invisible. Griffin was throwing off one garment after another. So Jeffers and the men who came to help him were hit by blows from nowhere. So ultimately, Jeffers was knocked unconscious when he made a last attempt to hold on to the invisible scientist. So now Griffin had shaken himself free and no one knew where to lay hands on him. So we have read that Griffin is the main character of the story. The entire story revolves around him. Griffin was a brilliant but eccentric scientist. He made one experiment after another. He discovered that the human body could become invisible and transparent, but he misused his discovery. Griffin even committed theft and burglaries. He was a lawless person. His invisibility was possible only when he didn't wear any clothes. So the burglary committed in the clergyman's house was really a shameful act to the people like Griffin. All these things brought infamy to him. So Griffin was a brilliant scientist. Although he was a brilliant scientist, yet he was a lawless person. Footprints without feet summary. This story is about a scientist named Griffin. So Griffin was a great but eccentric scientist. He was actually a lawless person. He used to become invisible. He had been discovering ways which could make a man invisible and finally swallowed certain rare drugs that made him invisible. He was first noticed by two boys in staircase of a house where they could just see his footsteps. There were footsteps and they started following it. Those two boys started following the footprints. They follow it until the footsteps are fainter. Fainter means weaker and cannot be seen. First, as he is feeling cold, he enters a mall for some warmth. After the stores shut down, he decides to wear some warm clothes and eat something. Actually, there was winter season at that time in London, so he decided to enter a London store and there he decided to wear some warm clothes and eat something. So we read that Griffin entered a big London store as it was very cold outside and in the midwinter the air was bitterly cold. It was not possible to live without clothes. So instead of walking around the streets, he decided to enter into a big London store for warmth. Griffin broke open boxes and wrappers. Now he first of all unboxes a few clothes and wears them. Then from the kitchen of a restaurant he eats cold meat and some coffee. So there he wore shoes, an overcoat and a hat. Now he became a fully dressed and visible person and he also took cold meat and coffee and also sweets and wine. Later he goes to a grocery store and eats sweets and drinks wine. And he then falls asleep on a pile of quilts. He then wakes up in the morning when some of the store assistants had seen him because he did not get up until the assistants of the shop arrived next morning. So when they started chasing him, he tried to escape and also became invisible quickly, taking off his clothes. He became naked in chilled January once again. He entered that store just because to get warmth, but now once again he had to remove his clothes because the assistants were chasing him. He quickly threw away all the clothes he was wearing and became invisible again. Then he started roaming around again without any clothes in the cold winters of London. Griffin then decides to steal clothes from a theatre company as he knew he would get something there to cover his face as well. He then steals bandages for his face, dark glasses, false nose and a hat for covering himself. He then hits the shopkeeper and steals all his money. Soon he realizes that London is too crowded to live like this and decides that he would go to a remote village. Now he decided to go to a village. He books 2 rooms at an inn. Inn means a small hotel at the Iping village. Now, first of all, when he was wandering in the streets of London, he decided to enter big London store. There he entered. After that he went to a theatre company and now after stealing things from that theatre company he went towards an inn. Now let us read Griffin's entry into Iping village. Griffin reaches there, and it is strange for the people of Iping that a stranger with such a weird appearance, weird means strange, has come to stay at an inn during the winter season. Once his money is over, he steals from people and also hits the landlord and his wife when they try to check his room in his absence. Actually, Griffin came out of the crowded London and took a train to the village Iping. There he booked 2 rooms at the local inn, and the owner's wife, Mrs. Hall, wanted to be friendly with him, but he was not interested in doing so. He wanted to live in solitude, and there also, when his money gets over, he steals from clergyman's room, and he also hits the landlord and his wife when they try to check his room in his absence. One day, the landlord and his wife were surprised to see the scientist's door open. So it was a good chance for them to enter. So they both entered. Then suddenly Mrs. Hall heard a sniff close to her ear. Within a moment, the hat on the bedpost leapt up and dashed itself into her face. The bedroom chair became alive. They were pushed out of the room. The door was slammed and locked after them. Suddenly Mrs. Hall fell down the stairs in frenzy. So she was convinced that the room was haunted by spirits. So it was the thinking of people that the trouble was caused by witchcraft. When the news of the burglary at the clergyman's house came into light, it was suspected that there was only the hand of Griffin behind it. So the suspicion even became stronger when he produced some ready cash. So at last, the village constable is asked for help. But before that, Mrs. Hall, the wife of the landlord, asks him questions regarding who he is and what he did to her furniture. This makes him really furious. He got very angry and he decides to show her who he really is. The people then see a headless man, and Mr. Jeffers, the constable, also finds out that he would have to arrest a man who doesn't have a head. Now the village constable arrived at the spot. Instead of waiting for the constable, Mrs. Hall went to the scientist first, and she started asking some questions. And the scientist became furious and threw off bandages, whiskers, spectacles, nose, etc. And he became a headless man. And now the village constable, Mr. Jaffer, was also quite surprised to find that he had to arrest the man who was without head. But he had to do his duty. But they are unable to catch Griffin as he removes all his clothes and becomes invisible. He even knocks out Jeffers as he tries to catch him. So now in meanwhile there occurred a new scene. The policeman who was trying to get hold of the man who was becoming more and more invisible. He threw off one cloth after another. Ultimately a shirt flew into the air. The policeman was struggling within himself. The people who tried to help the policeman were hit by blows that came from nowhere. Ultimately, Jeffers got unconscious while he was making an attempt to hold on to the unseen scientist. So now Griffin was invisible and free. So this is the summary of Footprints Without Feet, in which we have read about Griffin, who was a scientist, brilliant scientist, who discovered a rare drug to become invisible, but he misused his discovery. He was a lawless person. So we have read the introduction of the author H.G. Wells. Then we read introduction of the chapter, and after that summary. Now let us learn some new words. First word is muddy. Muddy means covered in or full of mud. Next is imprints. It means impress or stamp on a surface. Bare. It means not clothes or covered. Next is gazed. It means looked at steadily and intently, especially in admiration, surprise or thought. Next is remarkable. It means worthy of attention or striking. Fascinated. It means strongly attracted and interested. Fainter means weaker or barely perceptible. Difficult to see. Bewildered. It means perplexed and confused or very puzzled. Eject. It means compel someone to leave a place. Next is expense. It means the cost incurred in or required for something. Next is panicked. It means feel or cause to feel panic. Callously, in a way that shows an insensitive and cruel disregard for others. Solitude. It means the state or situation of being alone. Eccentric. It means unconventional and slightly strange. Curious. It means strange or unusual. Clergyman. It means a male priest, minister or religious leader, especially a Christian one. Next is poker. It means a metal rod with a handle used for prodding and stirring an open fire. So these are the new words. Now homework. Answer the following questions. You are supposed to find out the answers of these questions and write in your practice notebook. Question number 1. How did the invisible man first become visible? Question number 2. Why was he wandering the streets? He means Griffin. Question number 3. Why does Mrs. Hall find the scientist eccentric? Question number 4. What curious episode occurs in the study? Next is, what other extraordinary things happen at the inn? Question number 6. Griffin was rather a lawless person. Comment. Or how can you say that Griffin was a lawless person? Question number 7. It is, how would you assess Griffin as a scientist? If you like our videos, please press the like button and subscribe our channel. Thank you.